Most people are missing an extremely key piece of context when reading the Monroe Doctrine. And that missing context is the allies that Monroe spoke of. Think of it this way: forming an opinion on the Monroe Doctrine without knowing who the allies were is like forming an opinion on the current Ukraine conflict without knowing who NATO is. And that's not an exaggeration. So, who were the allies? To break it down, in the early 1820s, there had been ongoing talks between the Holy Alliance and the Bourbons. After Napoleon's defeat, the dynastic monarchical lineage called the House of Bourbon had regained control in France and Spain. And so those two nations had restored friendly relations with each other under the Bourbon Restoration. Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburgs in Austria had formed something called the Holy Alliance. And they had made a pact between themselves that they would squash any popular uprisings within their borders. So they would send their army to the other countries if there were any citizen revolutions against the monarchs. And there were rumors and or talks at that time between the Holy Alliance and the House of Bourbon regarding the inclusion of Spain and France in that pact to squash citizen revolutions. So, for example, if France were to have another revolution, then Russia, Prussia, and Spain would all send troops to help squash that revolution. And I would imagine that that pact would have extended to the colonies of France, Spain, and Russia as well. And in fact, these powers did help each other in squashing popular uprisings in Italy and Spain just prior to Monroe's speech. They did so through a broader alliance called the Quintuple Alliance, which was essentially the Holy Alliance, the Bourbons, and Britain. But Britain didn't want to help in quashing uprisings outside of their own colonial empire. It's kind of complicated. Britain was ahead of the pack in regards to development, and had changed their geopolitical game plan from territorial to economic conquest. In any case, the Holy Alliance and the House of Bourbon were considering a more formal pact with each other for the express purpose of quashing people's revolutions. So that gives you a sense of why Monroe was addressing the issue of European expansion in the New World. And that's who he's referring to when he says the Allied powers. At minute 725 in this video, I go through the original text of the doctrine pertaining to the Allies. And you'll see that Monroe's intent was quite the opposite of imperialist. It's not to say that his doctrine wasn't taken out of context and used decades later by future US presidents to try to justify actual imperialist actions. That did happen. But Monroe had made clear in his speech that he saw the Western Hemisphere as having a very different system of governance from monarchical Europe, the Old World. And he genuinely viewed the Western Hemisphere, especially in light of all the new republics taking control in Mexico and South America in the 1810s and 20s, as a new movement. That these new sovereign republics making up the Americas were advancing humanity. And he didn't want it all to be reversed by actors from the old monarchical system coming in and recolonizing them. And beyond what Monroe felt about all this, the US wasn't even a developed nation yet, as I show in this video and in this longer one. Nowhere near as developed as actual world powers like Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, or Russia, with a navy nowhere near the size of those powers' navies. At the time of this speech, the US had 16 war vessels at sea. Half of those were either in the Mediterranean or in the Pacific. So 8 whole war vessels in the Caribbean. And some of those were only 12 feet long. I'm 6 feet long, by the way. But even though Monroe had more vessels in production and had seriously begun developing the US Navy, it was still dwarfed by those of the European powerhouses. So even if he'd wanted to control the Western Hemisphere, he wouldn't have had the means to do so. So you might be saying to yourself now, okay, Josh, so Monroe's doctrine may not have been imperialist, but why are you so caught up on excusing Monroe? The answer is that in the very same speech in which he issued this doctrine, Monroe called for the construction of mega infrastructure projects and protection for the nation's infant tech sectors. After 16 years of presidents who completely ignored the nation's development, Monroe directly addressed it. When a leader of an undeveloped country calls for rapid industrial development using government resources to do so, he stands in direct opposition to the propaganda arm of the world's dominant imperialist power. At that time, Britain. Britain had been pushing the free trade ideology after they'd gotten a head start on industrial development. They did so because free trade benefits the nation who's already producing manufactured goods and inhibits the growth of manufacturing in undeveloped nations. I go more in depth into all that in these videos, but it's important to understand that Monroe was part of the pro-development political faction in the US. It was they who developed the country against the wishes of the British Empire. So I want to make people aware of this faction, their achievements, and their policies. And remember that in the speech that we all tend to see as the pinnacle of imperialist rhetoric, Monroe was setting an example of successful industrial development policy for all Global South nations who are currently under the boot of today's imperialist hegemon to learn from, because development through free trade is nothing but propaganda. Please subscribe and like.